This lecture is entitled Religion and the National Movement. We know that, as I elaborated last time in our opening session, that the course in general is concerned with the phenomenon of nationalism, a very secular phenomenon, or nationality building, the very name of the course, and it very specifically among a particular stateless people, which are called Carpatho-Rusyns, and we've gone into who they are last time. And among the characteristics that help us define a nationality, so last time we spoke about what nationalism is, what a nationality is, and among the potential characteristics, potential, not that you have to have all of them, but one of them is religion. And in the case of Carpatho-Rusyns, the role of religion was of very great significance throughout virtually this entire period that we are looking at, and I shouldn't have taken that off so that we're reminded of our long historic 19th century. So virtually throughout this entire period and beyond, as we're going to see, religion had a very important role to play. And in the case of Carpatho-Rusyns, throughout virtually this entire period, this long 19th century, as well as the short 20th century, which one speaks about as running from 1918 to 1989, religion is of great importance. Throughout most of this period, in particular the long 19th century, the dominant, one might say even exclusive religion among Carpatho-Rusyns was what was known as Uniate Catholicism. Uniate Catholicism. Well, what was this Uniate Catholicism? Well, in order to answer that question, we're going to have to give a little bit of some basic background about Christianity, which willy-nilly is the historically dominant religion in Europe. So a few points. I'm going to try to do this as briefly as possible, but there are kind of 6 points that one might want to keep in mind. The first is that initially there was only one Christian church, which in the course of the 4th century, the late 300s, after being oppressed and persecuted, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So the civilized environment of Europe at the time, around the Mediterranean Sea, north and south, Roman rule, Roman Empire became officially a Christian entity. Within that Roman Empire, and immediately after it started to transform itself, or decline, one might say, from the 5th century onward, there were 2 centers of the Christian church. One was the city of Rome itself, for the western part of the Christian church. So we have Rome on the one hand, and the other was the city and eventual capital of the East Roman and then entire Roman Empire, Constantinople. And there, in these both cases, the church the Western Church was headed by a pope, and the Eastern Church by an ecumenical patriarch. So now we have these two poles, if you will, within the Christian world. Well, that was still all right. They more or less functioned together. Some disagreement, but they functioned together. But then in the year 1054, began a split, an open split, so that from 1054 on, and it gets worse and less tolerant between the two, we have now Rome versus Constantinople. The Western Christian world versus the Eastern Christian world. The Western Christian world in Rome, also known as the Latin Rite, uses the Latin language, versus the Eastern or Byzantine Rite Orthodox Church in the East. I'll put Orthodox down because it's not unimportant. The Orthodox world, using the Eastern Rite, also known as the Byzantine Rite, because the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, came to be known popularly as the Byzantine Empire. And by the way, where is Constantinople today? Istanbul. It's Istanbul, precisely. Exactly. So here we have these two poles, these two worlds, Rome and Constantinople. Why is the Eastern world important? Well, because when the Roman world, the Roman Christian world, was interested in drawing into its orbit other peoples in Europe who still had various forms of paganism, bringing them into the Christian realm, Christianizing them. Central Europe and Eastern Europe was primarily, not exclusively, primarily Christianized from the East, from the Byzantine world, from Constantinople. The two most famous of the missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, were actually both blood brothers and monastic brothers who were sent out by Byzantium to Christianize the populations of Central and Eastern Europe, in particular the East Slavs, and we know that Carpatho-Rusyns are East Slavs, as well as some of the South Slavs, and Romanians, by the way. And so, since the Orthodox Byzantine form of Christianity, the Eastern form of Christianity, is important for our story, well, how is it different from the other half of the Christian world, the Roman world? Well, first of all, in the Eastern Christian Church, the liturgical language, the official language of the church, was not Latin, as it was in the Western Church. Rather, it was either Greek or Slavonic, Slavonic being a form of Slavic languages. So either Greek or Slavonic, not Latin. The other thing that was different is that the tradition of priests being able to be married remained in force in the Orthodox Eastern world, even after celibacy was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church. And another thing, the Eastern Church, as you can see being much more traditionalist, maintained the calendar such as it was, the Julian calendar, But in the 16th century, as a result of scientific discovery, rationalists suggested that the Julian calendar wasn't so great. We have to adopt a calendar that is not based on the moon as the Julian calendar was, but rather on revolutions around the sun. And so in the late 16th century, the Roman Catholic Pope Gregorian adopted the Western calendar. As a result of that, you had to change the thing. So the Eastern calendar is quote-unquote 2 weeks behind. So if you're living in Canada, you probably have heard that Christmas is generally on December 25th, but then these Ukrainians and some other East Slavs and South Slav celebrate Christmas on January 6th, 2 weeks later, because these calendars are 2 weeks apart, so to speak. So that's the reason for this. There were also certain points of dogma that were different between both churches. I'm not going to get into that, a little bit complex. But also church authority. Here's a key one. Who's the head of the Christian church? Is the head of the Christian church the Pope in Rome, as Western Christians would say? Or, this is just another one of the bishops. He's the Bishop of Rome, and that, in the end, we follow the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, and not the Pope in Rome. And lastly, church architecture was quite different. So it's in the Eastern Church, they're pretty distinct. These are the churches that use as a basic architectural form a Greek cross, which is a square, and they put golden domes on the top. You see them all around Toronto, because many of these Ukrainian Catholic, Ukrainian Orthodox Church in particular, but also Serbian and others have these golden domes. So the external architecture is different, and internally even more so, because when you walk into an Eastern church, the dominant thing that you see is a screen that blocks the altar, so you don't really see the priest. And that screen is known as an iconostasis. Why an iconostasis? Because it has paintings or drawings on it called icons. Not like the icon. Well, that's where the word comes from. Because actually, an original icon is a painting through which you can see a Holy Spirit into the heavens. It's through that. Just like your icon here, you put up an icon, and then you can see through your machine somewhere else. That's why they developed or used this term icon. Okay, so those are the basic characteristic differences. Now, those Orthodox East Slavs who resided in the Habsburg realm that we've just been speaking about, some of them entered into union according to two church unions, one in 1596 and the other in 1646. So some of the Orthodox Eastern Rite, Byzantine church leaders, or hierarchs, entered into union during these 2 years. Union with Rome. Well, what did that mean? What did this church union mean? Well, these Orthodox bishops and priests voluntarily accepted the authority of the Pope in Rome. Remember this question of authority. Who's the head of the church? So they voluntarily accepted that, okay, the head of the church is the Pope in Rome. But on one condition. And that condition was that they would be able to retain all of their Orthodox customs. So in a sense, this new institution, what we're calling the Uniate Church, was both Orthodox and Catholic. A kind of church in between the Western Roman and the Eastern Byzantine Christian worlds. the in-between church. That was the Uniat church that we're talking about, to which Carpatho-Rusyns and other East Slavs living in the Habsburg Empire belonged. Now, it is also true that after these church unions of 1596 and 1646 were implemented, the Orthodox didn't just simply disappear or disappear immediately. This move to Uniatism took some time, but by the mid-18th century, which is really on the eve of our long 19th century, all of the East Slavs and the Romanians living in the Habsburg realm were now Uniats. And so that's the background for this Uniat church that we are speaking about. Talked about church authority, which is related to jurisdictions. I mean, who's the boss? Under which jurisdiction do you belong? Well, in the beginning, this Uniat church, among Carpatho-Rusyns in particular, which would have been the Hungarian kingdom, was not didn't have its own jurisdictional independence. Why? Because ever since this 1646 union, the bishops of the area, which is called Mukachevo, it's one of those places on your map. It's in the middle of Subcarpathian Rus. This is where the bishops resided. Bishops are the head of a particular territorial jurisdiction. Same in the Western Church and the Eastern Church. Well, these bishops for the Uniats really were only kind of representatives. They were kind of subordinate to a Roman Catholic archbishop in Hungary. And they didn't like this. They struggled against this. And finally, in 1771, the state steps in. Which state? The Habsburg state. Under whom? Under Maria Theresa. This is 1771. She steps in and issues a decree. She issues a decree, gets it approved by the Pope, as a result of which now this diocese or Eparchy of Mukachevo becomes jurisdictionally distinct, so that their head, their bishop, is no longer subordinate to some Roman Catholic bishop. By the way, it was also at this time, roughly 1774, at the request of the heads of the Uniat Church itself, they felt that this term Uniat was degrading or denigrating. And so they requested that that their church name be changed from Uniat to Greek Catholic. So instead of Uniat Catholic to Greek Catholic. Of course, this becomes totally confusing because these people are not Greeks. Really, it should have been Byzantine Greek or just simply Byzantine, but Greek Catholic. So now we have all these non-ethnic Greek Catholics who are mostly Slavs or Romanians living in the Habsburg Empire. And that term, Greek Catholic, continued to exist until the mid-20th century, throughout and including in North America. And it's only subsequent that different names have been used. So that's where you get the term Ukrainian Catholic. It's the same, everything is the same. Uniat, Greek Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic, Romanian Catholics, all the same. It's this church in between. And I guess since it's in between, it has to have more than one name, just to make everything confusing. Now, the reigning bishop, head of the church, head of this territorial entity called an eparchy or a diocese based in Mukachevo. At the time was a man named Andriy Bachynskyi. Andriy Bachynskyi. During his period of heading the church, close to 4 decades, well into the chronological 19th century, he put his diocese, his eparchy, on a solid financial, administrative, and educational basis. It was also during Bachynskyi's nearly 4 decades that the seat of the church moved from this town of Mukachevo itself to another town a little bit farther west called Uzhhorod. Of course, you never change the name of an eparchy, even if the seat is no longer where it is. So it's still called the Eparchy or the Diocese of Mukachevo, but it's located in the town of Uzhhorod. Point is that in Uzhhorod, he oversaw the construction of a monumental complex of buildings that included the bishop's residence, a library alongside the cathedral church. He was this Bishop Bachynskyi, concerned with raising the educational and intellectual environment of the eparchy. He supported the Central Greek Catholic Seminary in the imperial capital of Vienna, while in this town of Uzhhorod, he established a local seminary to train priests, encouraged them to set up in each of their parish churches an elementary school to be staffed by graduates of another institution which he founded, that is a college for teachers and for cantors, which is very important in this church. He also supported the publication of elementary grammars, or what we call primers, and catechisms to teach religion, but all in the local language, which was following the precepts of the Habsburg rulers at the time. He also published a Church Slavonic edition of the Bible for the first time, and he encouraged the priests under his authority to write histories of the eparchy, the diocese, and histories of the population, these Carpatho-Rusyns uniates. All of these activities effectively brought aspects of Europe's late 18th century enlightenment to Carpatho-Rusyns. So he was an enlightener in the tradition of France and Austria precisely at this time in the late chronological 18th century. By the way, it also became clear during Bachynskyi's lifetime that this eparchy diocese of Mukachevo was territorially very large. It covered all of the northeastern corner of the Hungarian kingdom. So if we're looking at a map like this, it's basically all of this area here. So it was quite large, unwieldy, at a time in which communication was minimal, very difficult to control it. And so during his reign made a decision to divide this eparchy into 2 parts. So we still had the eparchy of Mukachevo and Uzhhorod, but then the western portion of this in the Prešov region, another town that is, you'll need to know and do know already on your map, a town called Prešov, which is in present-day eastern Slovakia. This now became the seat of a separate diocese or eparchy. So now we have 2. We have the Uniat or Greek Catholic Eparchy of Mukachevo, and we have the Uniat or Greek Catholic Eparchy of Prešov. As a result, both of these cities, which we're going to hear about over and over again, Uzhhorod on the one hand, present-day Ukraine, Prešov on the other, present-day Slovakia, became each in its own way a center of the civic and educational institution, and therefore two major cultural centers for Carpatho-Rusyns living on the southern slopes of the Carpathians. These two towns, Uzhhorod and Mukachevo. Now, I already mentioned in our earlier lecture how the policies of the Austrian Habsburg authorities were especially constructive in the realm of education. In the year 1777, our reformer empress, Maria Theresa, issued something called the Ratio Educationis. Ratio Educationis. Latin word for the educational schema. This was a decree designed to implement universal education. Of great importance was the fact that the vernacular, or the spoken language of the local inhabitants, was to be the language of instruction at the elementary level in the school system. I've already mentioned this, but it's exceedingly important. And also for those slightly upper level schools to train teachers to teach in the elementary school system. Now, by the way, this was a typical situation which we have in all modern states. It's very easy for governments to pass laws. But then they have to be implemented. And if they pass laws for reforms, which cost money, well, then you have to pass other laws to get the money to implement the laws. So the Austrian Empire, like goodwill on the part of the emperors, we passed these great laws, liberal laws, but then there's no funding package. And so what happens? Well, the state says, okay, churches, you take care of the schools. You have to have elementary education, but your responsibility. So that's effectively what happened. Elementary education in the vernacular language became the responsibility of the Uniate or Greek Catholic Church. The Austrian imperial government was a bit more successful in supporting financially higher level education. In an attempt to raise the theological and the general educational standards of future Greek Catholic priests, a general seminary was established in the imperial capital at Vienna, actually connected to a church of St. Barbara, which still exists today. That's why it's known as the Barbareum. And this institution functioned for a good 10 years, and then other institutions in Uzhhorod itself were established. Now, another important aspect of the era that we're talking about, of Maria Theresa and Joseph, were efforts undertaken toward the formation, for the first time, of a Carpatho-Rusyns historical identity. A historical identity. Another one of these factors of nationalism, the role of history. And it's from precisely this period that dates the first history of Carpatho-Rusyns, which was published in 1749 by a very close advisor to whom? Maria Theresa. So she had conversations with this, actually, Roman Catholic Jesuit and say, listen, we need a history of these people. So he writes a history of these people. His name was a man named František Kollár. Less important his name than what he was proposing in this first history of this stateless people. His writing was clearly designed to enhance the status of Carpatho-Rusyns, arguing that they were the indigenous inhabitants of their homeland in the Danubian basin. Namely, they didn't come after somebody else. And also that they received Christianity way back in the 9th century, in the late 800s, directly from those Byzantine missionaries, St. Cyril and Methodius, that were sent out from the Byzantine Empire. He also suggested that they had their own independent Rus principality in the early Middle Ages, and also that this eparchy, this diocese of Mukachevo, had already existed in the 9th century as a result of the missionary work of St. Cyril and Methodius. Now, whether this was true or not actually is irrelevant. It was put down on paper, and readers and other historians took it at face value. And so all of this enhanced the status of people that didn't even have their own state. The interests of this Uniat Greek Catholic Eparchy of Mukachevo, this time purely material interests, were what motivated yet another history of Carpatho-Rusyns, this time at the very end of the 19th century, a big 2-volume history in 6 parts from 1799, published until 1807, precisely during the period of Bishop Bachynskyi. And this work is a typical thing that's also what we would call the use of history. Make a long story short, an important monastery laid claim to lands that they said that they got as a gift from some medieval prince. The local landlord said, no, you just took these lands, they really belong to me. And so what does the monastery do? It commissions one of its monks to write a history, find documents or create documents proving that this medieval prince had given the land to the monastery. But in that process of writing a history for purposes other than knowledge itself, in and of itself, but for legal reasons, then we have another narrative of Carpatho-Rusyns. So this adds to this stock of knowledge of historical narratives. The culmination of this new trend at writing histories, in order to justify the existence and legal rights of Carpatho-Rusyns and their church, the culmination of that came during the first half of the 19th century from the pen of an Uzhhorod priest from Uzhhorod named Mikhail Lutskay, L-U-C-H-K-A-I. In the 1840s, he completed a monumental 6-volume Historia Carpatho-Ruthenorum, in English, written in Latin, called, in English, The History of Carpatho-Rusyns. It actually was not, it remained in manuscript, not published until the second half of the 20th century, but consulted by the intelligentsia, which is important. And this history by this man, Lutskay, continued the tradition of glorifying the past of Carpatho-Rusyns. Again, even if most of the claims were in the realm of romanticized mythology. Here we are now in the 1830s. We're moving along in the 19th century. And the 1830s also marked the beginnings of another movement in Europe, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, called Pan-Slavism. And this movement called Pan-Slavism was actually a reaction to another movement that existed at the time called Pan-Germanism. Germany did not exist as a country. It was made up of all of these tiny little duchies, etc. And the German intelligentsia didn't feel so good about this. They wanted to have one state. They were weak. During the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century, completely conquered by Napoleon, by French cultural, military domination. And so they figured they are going to create a movement in which bringing all of the representatives of, from their perspective, Germanic lands together so that they could make the Germanic peoples a strong entity and eventually create a unified German state. Well, now we have the Slavic peoples, with the exception of the Russian Empire, all living in also different empires, whether they're Poles or Czechs or Slovaks or Croats or Serbs, Bulgarians, etc. And this pan-Slavic movement has another purpose or a similar purpose that is initiated as it was amongst Slavic intellectuals, in particular in the Habsburg Empire. That's where it began. The adherents or the leaders of this pan-Slavic movement argued that all Slavs should learn about each other, first step. And how to do this? Well, through increased contacts and cooperation via publications, personal visits. Goal, to improve the cultural and civic status of their respective peoples, wherever they may live. Even in the Russian Empire, where it was, quote unquote, a Slavic state, Pan-Slavism, supporters there known as Slavophiles, there this movement took on a very particular political and nationalist character that was associated with Tsarist Russia's foreign policy goal of expansionism into the Balkans, into Central Europe, and eventually liberation of younger brother Slavs, whether they be Poles or Czechs or Slovaks or Serbs, etc., from the empires in which they live. Now, Carpatho-Russian intellectuals were also influenced by this movement called Pan-Slavism. And hence they sought to determine who they were. What was their exact position within this Slavic world? The result was several writings, some published, others in the form of unpublished letters, that speculated on the relationship of Carpatho-Rusyns with the rest of the Slavic, and in particular, East Slavic world. What, after all, did these terms Rus mean? Rus, or Rusnak, or Rusin. They call themselves this, but what did it mean? Were the carriers of those ethnonyms, the Carpatho-Rusyns, were they a branch of the northern Great Russian people, or of the southern Little Russian people, or Ukrainian people in modern day terms? Or were they, together with the Russians and the Belarusians and the Ukrainians, part of one larger Rus, or Russian people, actually? These questions were discussed in journal articles, in correspondence between Carpatho-Rusyns, visits from intellectuals from the Russian Empire to this region, to other Slavic inhabited peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so this was what Pan-Slavism meant, getting to know each other for an eventual political purpose. There was another more immediate challenge faced by educated Carpatho-Rusyns, and especially those living in that Hungarian kingdom, that is the largest component of the Habsburg realm. What was the problem among them? Well, why should they not simply assimilate to Hungarian culture and become Hungarians or Magyars? By the way, one of the leading Hungarian political activists at the time, a man named Kossuth, was actually proposing this in the 1830s and 1840s, not only for Carpatho-Rusyns, but for other peoples living in the Hungarian Empire, or Hungarian kingdom, whether they be Slovaks or Romanians, should all become Hungarians. You live in Hungary, no? And this was certainly a tempting option, and one which was indeed chosen by many Greek Catholic priests that we're talking about, who actually, in effect, were the only real educated stratum among Carpatho-Rusyns. But there were a few of those very same priests who objected to this trend, and in particular, this trend of becoming Hungarian, and in particular, a priest from this new eparchy of Prešov, a priest named Oleksandr Dukhnovych. Dukhnovych, a name that we will continue to encounter, certainly when we discuss the 19th century and even the 20th century. At this time, this would have been the 1840s, Dukhnovych was particularly concerned with educating his Carpatho-Rusyn flock. In contrast to his predecessors who wrote religious texts, grammars, school textbooks in the liturgical language of Church Slavonic, Dukhnovych published in 1847 something called a Reader for Beginners. That is, an elementary textbook written in an easily accessible and understandable vernacular Rusin language. That is the language of the people. This goes back to the importance of language, written language. What form of written language? And so he's arguing, and he, not arguing, but actually carried out and writes a textbook that people, that young kids can understand. Now, it is clear that there was still much intellectual and educational activity to be undertaken during the first half of the 19th century on behalf of Carpatho-Rusyns, but it was basically carried out by individuals. Individuals who were often isolated from each other. In effect, no organized, specifically Carpatho-Rusyn civic or cultural life yet existed. It was all individuals. But all of that was to change with the dawn of what became the revolutionary year of 1848. And it is to that revolutionary year that we will address ourselves next week. Thank you.